Hey, welcome back, constant readers, to my next instalment on my quest to read through all of Stephen King's entire bibliography. Today, we are talking about, in my opinion, a very underrated gem in the Stephen King universe, and that is Dolores Claiborne. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, especially if you enjoy King's books as much as I do. I plan to go through all of them. Now, I went into reading this book without any prior knowledge, never even heard of Dolores Claiborne, so I had no expectations on what this would be like. You can imagine my surprise when I discover it's a very heartfelt 300-page drama about the real-life traumatic consequences of abuse. It's so unlike anything I've read previously from King, because it had so much grit, and it never wavered on its hard-hitting subject material, and that's because it didn't need to. Like, it never sold out for anything supernatural or overly fantastical. I think since finishing the book, I've tried to do some research around its background, and honestly, I couldn't find that much about it. It seems to sort of fade into the background when you compare it to some of the more iconic Stephen King novels, which is really a shame because I enjoyed it so much, and I think it fires on all cylinders, unlike some Stephen King books where certain aspects don't quite deliver and you're left disappointed. So, from what I could gather, Stephen King wrote Dolores Claiborne in 1992, which was the same decade as Rose Madder and Gerald's Game. They all sort of deal with the same ongoing themes of abuse and how women especially are victims of abuse at the hands of men. I haven't read the other two yet, but I think the general consensus is that Dolores Claiborne is King's most successful attempt at portraying domestic abuse. And I think that's because, unlike the other two, it really sort of stays on the straight and narrow. Like, it's more of a sort of thriller reality piece than it is anything else, where I think Gerald's Game and Rose Madder, from what I've heard at least, they sort of devolve into more supernatural explanations for what's going on, and I think that sort of cheapens what you're trying to tell me about abuse and women. And so I think that's partly why Claiborne is the standout, because it doesn't rely on the same crutches. The reader is kept interested regardless. I think another theme that is found in King's writing is how he likes to relate his works to one another. In the 90s, he wrote Desperation, while under the alias of Richard Bachman, he also wrote The Regulators, and the two sort of act as like sister novels. They have the same cast of characters, they're just in different circumstances. And I think that's such a cool concept, and that was why King flipped the concept on its head with another set of twin novels. We have Dolores Claiborne and Gerald's Game, where the characters are different, but they go through parallel circumstances. So it's the opposite of how Regulators and Desperation are connected. I think originally King wanted Dolores Claiborne and Gerald's Game to be concurrent narratives in one bigger novel that was going to be called In the Path of the Eclipse. And I think that explains why the two books were published only 6 months apart. I think Gerald's Game was published in May of 92 and Dolores Claiborne was published in November. It also explains how in both stories they sort of... the climax takes place during the solar eclipse of 1963, and even though the two stories are in separate locations, both Dolores Claiborne and Jessie Burlingame, they see visions of each other that coincide with the eclipse. Like Dolores, when she's killing her husband, she sees Jessie get abused by her father, while at the same time Jessie sees Dolores when she's handcuffed to the bed, she can still see Dolores as if she's in the position of Joe St. George at the bottom of the well, sort of looking up. And it's an interesting way of doing it, the fact that they're separate but they still relate to one another. I like that, especially as it's not canon, like it's not a saga in any way. And I can see why some people suggest that these two stories suffer from being uneven, because without each other to support them, had they stayed together, it might have been a more well-rounded book. And for a while, I speculated reading it that Dolores and Jesse were related in some way. And I think it would have made for a more compelling story had they been able to sort of meet up and support one another. It would show like the multi-generational friendship between women versus the sort of mother-daughter bond between Dolores and Selena. It would be like a lesson in how, almost like how the blood of the covenant is thicker than the water of the womb. It would be that kind of idea. That, two people who've gone through a traumatic experience, they automatically have a connection that can't be easily broken. Stephen King's also speculated about writing a third book that completes the trilogy of In the Path of the Eclipse. At this point, I don't think that's happening. Stephen King's getting older now. He's not writing as much as he used to. I also just think it doesn't need to happen. Dolores Claiborne, at least, I haven't read Gerald's Game, but it follows a very natural conclusion. So for a writer who infamously doesn't know how to get his endings right, I don't think that this is one where an ending is needed. I don't think it needs a third instalment, but who knows. I think what makes Stephen King such a trailblazer in the horror landscape especially is that even with his more recent work, he's never afraid to be experimental with his themes. Like his narrative style, his overall structure. In Dolores Claiborne, it's all a very big creative swing. It's a classic example of King taking a risk, and I think in this instance, that risk pays off. So Dolores has turned herself into the police for the they think it's to do with the murder of Vera Donovan, but it's actually to do with the murder of Joe St. George. And she's giving a confession to 2 police officers and a stenographer, and that's the entire novel. It revolves around this exchange. All 300 pages is her continuous sort of stream of consciousness as she relates her life to these officers, the last sort of 30, 40 years worth. We never hear them speak to her. It's only her replies. All the dialogue is internalised by her. It's entirely limited to how she chooses to recreate her flashbacks. And I think there's a few reasons why I love this. Firstly, reclamation. Because traditionally women, especially women who have been victims of abuse, they've been silenced on topics that were sensitive if they sort of were heard by the wrong people. And so this entire book is like an uninterrupted confession from a woman who spent her life being talked over and downtrodden. And that in of itself is empowering. It's finally this woman's turn to tell the story that's about her, but at least now it's finally from her perspective. On top of that, while she establishes that she is an unreliable narrator and we can't accept everything that she says to be gospel, she also outlines her own motivation. Everyone on the island has badmouthed her for years, and now this is her trying to clear her own.
You go ahead, Mr. Mackey. You scribble that down in your pad there. You make a note on that. As long as you write down that saying a thing and doing it are 2 separate things.
She openly admits what she's done. She's committed to appearing vulnerable in this open space. She doesn't get readily embarrassed by it. And I think the way that she's so transparent about how she didn't kill her employer, but she did kill her husband, I think that automatically gives her a lot of credibility from us as a reader, because she's just so direct about it, about the fact that she killed her husband. And we're intrigued. We're like, oh yeah, tell us more. So Dolores, who is now age 65, she refuses to let the story be boring. She doesn't tell it from the beginning, she doesn't tell it from the end and work her way backwards. She works from the middle and relates the events in both directions. We see both the troubles surrounding her marriage to Joe St. George, and we see the troubles surrounding her employment with Vera Donovan as her housemaid. And later sole carer, as she became more dependent on her. I think this entire narrative is also set exclusively in the town of Little Tor, which is like a small island off the coast of Maine, of course. We immediately get the impression that Dolores is someone who's always given the shirt off her back to support other people. And because she's always been a giver, everyone's always taken a bit too much from her and taken advantage of her.
I guess you want to know somebody's life. You look at their hands.
We're almost waiting for her to have a nervous breakdown and start tearing people's faces off. But no, she never has that sort of the shining moment where she becomes like an axe murderer. The one murder she is guilty of was done purely to protect her children. She's so selfless that she sacrifices her own innocence to do right by her family. And she's not the cold-blooded killer that everyone around her makes her out to be. And so I like it when books sort of challenge that expectation versus reality. Dolores first met her husband, Joe St. George, when she was only young. She was an adolescent girl. She remembers fondly how pretty his clear-skinned forehead was when they kissed at their prom. I think Stephen King is trying to illustrate, rather heavy-handedly, that Joe wasn't always a bad man, and that in this moment his forehead was sort of clear of any wrinkles that come with the toils of life. At this point, everything was rosy. And again, maybe this is Dolores misremembering through rose-tinted glasses, but I think that's part of its charm. Dolores says how marrying Joe was the single greatest regret of her life. She rushed into a relationship with this boy, not realising that the father of her children would go on to become a very cruel and abusive man. Joe is very much your typical deadbeat. He's between jobs, he's an alcoholic, a wife beater, he neglects his kids. He has a myriad of problems. We can't get into all of them. I do wish that King would give Joe at least some sort of redeeming quality. I think King he devolves into caricatures a lot of the time. Like, Joe St. George is a bad person, but he's so exaggeratedly terrible that I do wish there'd been more to make it worthwhile, because the whole time you're like, it takes Dolores such a long time to kill him. And I guess she's afraid of how her children will cope without him. But he really doesn't do anything, so that argument feels like a non-starter. I guess we're meant to get the sense that she's such a saint, she can't bear the thought of murder. But I don't get that either. The most notorious instance of domestic abuse is when she relates how, because she laughed at a split in the back of Joe's trousers, he immediately loses his temper and hits her in the lower back with a piece of stove wood.
I'm like that all day long.
Why the hell you make me do it?
And it's so harrowing. She describes just being overcome with pain. She couldn't even stand up because her sort of kidney area was in such agony. She had to spend the rest of the afternoon sitting at the dinner table, insisting that their daughter Selena finish the dinner because she physically couldn't get up. I think this next part I'm in two minds about, because I can imagine, yes, if someone is being that awful to you, you do reach a breaking point. and Joe's bullying, she's had enough of it. But I do think it seems exaggerated from the perspective of the victim to so quickly fly into revenge, especially when she didn't want to make a scene earlier in front of the kids. So Dolores, she picks up a glass pitcher, the kind that you put cream in, and she brings it down on Joe's head, sort of smashing the glass against his ear that's all like bleeding.
Put in that goddamn mouth.
Guess what, Joe? I ain't tired anymore.
I don't know. It feels like a weird stance to take on abuse, that as a victim she automatically wants revenge. I think physically this makes for he's just so shocked, like he doesn't even stand up because he's so taken aback at first. And then Dolores, she picks up the hatchet and gives it to Joe, and she tells him, like, you know, kill me here right now, because if you lay a hand on me again, one of us is going to the morgue. And it's a very powerful scene. Like, that kind of ultimatum is very effective, and he doesn't lay a hand on her again, at least not in the recent future. But the problem is their daughter Selena witnesses her mum's anger and misinterprets her to be the abuser. And I think this double standard is sort of shown throughout the novel in a very interesting way, where if a man does certain things, he's sort of praised by his friends and he's not punished for the bad things. But the moment Dolores stands up for herself, she's seen as a brute by her daughter. And that's sort of the angle that is taken. Meanwhile, since they don't have enough money to live on, Joe spends most of his earnings on booze. Dolores finds a job working as a housemaid for the wealthy Vera Donovan. Vera is from Baltimore and originally only spends the summer on Little Tall Island with her family. Then her husband dies in a car crash, so she moves to the island full time. Dolores and Vera have quite a fun battle of wills. I will say it's their scenes together are very entertaining, and it only gets more extreme once Vera requires Dolores to move in and become her around-the-clock carer. I think the problem is that Vera has a very specific idea of how her house should be kept.
I do not pretend to be an easy woman to work for.
And if any of her rules are broken, there's a free strike policy, then you're fired. Certain washing products have to be used, the welcome mats have to face the guest at the front of the door, the bins have to be lined up properly, but most importantly, sheets. When you're hanging up sheets on the washing line, how many pins? This is probably the most famous quote from Dolores Claiborne, the 6 pins, Dolores, not 4. 4 pins gets you fired. The sheets must be hanged by 6 pins.
6 pins, Dolores. You know that's the way I like it. 6 pins, not 5.
This last rule is so important. Vera sits by the window and shouts out to Dolores to remind her every time she's hanging the sheets. And it's weird, the rule is so oddly specific and it's repeated so often in the book that I'd hoped that the 6 pins and all the sheets were foreshadowing something later in the style of like a Chekhov's gun. But it seems to be more of a red herring, like it has no significant bearing on the plot. I suppose if you really were searching, Dolores is hanging the sheets just before Vera dies. But again, it doesn't really have any major bearing, so I'm not... make of it what you will. Vera can also be very spiteful to Dolores. They have an ongoing feud that concerns her incontinence. Dolores starts to realise that Vera purposefully fouls her bed to annoy Dolores, who has to clean everything all over again, the sheets, the bedding, all of it. So she sets a trap for Vera, where knowing that Dolores vacuums the carpets, leaving Vera alone in her bedroom, one day Dolores gives the vacuum to another maid who pretends to be Dolores. And then this lowers Vera's guard enough that Dolores can then walk into the bedroom and catch her right in the act of trying to crap herself. I think it's a very funny scene, but it's also a very important scene because it shows us that Dolores... It shows us her character, for one. Like, she might be long-suffering, but she won't let you pull a wool over her eyes. She's not going to let you take her for a ride. She's the same way with George. She's the same way with Vera. If she smells a stunt, she'll get to the bottom of it. And she isn't someone who's just going to take it lying down.
When I get ready to settle your hash, I won't bother with poison. I'll just shove you out the window. I'll be one less smelly bitch in the world.
And you can tell, much like the shock when she hit Joe with the cream pitcher, Vera's eyes, she's embarrassed because she lost this battle of wills. And it's a nice juxtaposition, the way that they have this mental fight versus the physical fights that Joe likes to have. Something that I also forgot to mention is how well Stephen King is able to sort of characterise Dolores as a working class island woman. In a similar way, it kind of made me think of in A Clockwork Orange, the way that Anthony Burgess, he sort of creates a unique lexicon of slang phrases and contraptions that are typical of the characters. And so the way Dolores speaks, it's very reminiscent of that sort of Nadsat language. Like, she has her own sayings, she has her own ways of spelling certain words. And I think most importantly, something that's really difficult to communicate on a page, she has her own sense of humour. She really adds charm to the story. Like, Dolores litters her recollection with jokes, and they never detract from the seriousness of her account, even though she's like, joke, joke, joke. She's not trying to make a mockery of how serious this story is. She's just telling us, like, look, I'm not a deranged serial killer. I'm an everyday woman. I like to laugh. I'm a human being. It's easy to mock life than cry about how unfair it all is. And I think that's what really makes us warm to Dolores. We can tell that she is a fighter and she's someone who grows from hardship and becomes a better person. I think the fact the whole story is told through the lens of Dolores, it makes her one of the most fully realised characters to ever be put to paper by Stephen King, because we just spend so much time with her and looking at the situation through her lens. But on the theme of looking after Vera Donovan, what also made it so challenging to care for her is that in her old age, she grows quite senile. She starts to imagine things, and sometimes she'll scream from the bedroom to Dolores for help because she can see like wires coming out of the corners of her bedroom and the dust bunnies. If there's too much dust and it clumps together, she starts to see visions in the dust of her dead husband coming after her. It's very dramatic. Like, Dolores doesn't take any of this seriously, but later on in the book, after she kills Joe, she also gets nightmares and visions of the dust bunny sort of turning into this monstrous version of her dead husband. And I think dust was a good choice of metaphor for how even after an abuser is gone from your life, there are still those little things in your everyday experience that remind you of that person and all the horrible things they did to you. Like, physically, dust is made up of dead skin cells, like decaying skin. So for a small while after Joe's dead, a lot of that dust in the St. George household, at least, would have contained small bits of Joe. He would have been floating around in every nook and crevice. And I think even though this all happens at Vera's house, it's a clever tie-in to the lasting effects that a person can have on you after they're gone, particularly if it was something as intimate and harrowing as abuse. The story continues at this pace for a while, but I think the main catalyst for change, the thing that ultimately drives us to the climax of the story, is the things that Joe St. George does. His abuse starts to permeate through Dolores to their children, and I think that's when Dolores realises that something's got to give. Their eldest is their daughter Selena, who's about 14, and she's maturing physically into a woman, which proves to be too much temptation for Joe. Yes, her own father, her own flesh and blood. Knowing that she was witness to Dolores smashing the cream pitcher over his head, Joe uses that fact to sort of manipulate Selena into believing that he's the victim in all of this. And so she gives him her sympathy, and he sort of takes that and uses it to exploit her. It gives him ample opportunity while Dolores is working long hours at Vera Donovan's house to sexually abuse Selena, and it's horrible. It's really, really gross. And it happens for a few months as well. It happens for quite a while, because Dolores is so preoccupied with her job. When she does find out, she hates herself for not seeing the signs sooner.
Oh my God. It's your father, ain't it? He's been at you, hasn't he?
What are you talking about?
What's he done to you?
Nothing.
He's been touching you, hasn't he?
No!
What's he done to you, Selena?
Nothing.
You gotta tell me the truth now. It's important, baby.
No!
Selena,
Leave me alone!
Because Selena, she's been avoiding coming home. She's been staying at school for hours because she doesn't want to be around her dad. She's been neglecting her appearance to look as undesirable as possible to him. But I think the most telling sign is that she wasn't happy anymore. She'd lost that cheerful demeanour that her mum knew her for. And I think that is where it really escalates. You know, she's been groomed into believing her mum is this violent abuser, so she doesn't find her approachable. She has no one to confide into. And I think it's this instance where Dolores first develops her inside eye. You know, Joe has made her so angry that now she's looking at him with this inside eye that slowly is plotting revenge against him. You could argue that the eye serves as a premonition to the solar eclipse that watches over the murder of Joe St. George. Every time he does something terrible, her inside eye just gets darker until it's this like unavoidable pitch black hole in the sky. When she confronts Joe about Selena, she tells him that he has to stop, but he has this like wry grin on his face. Like, we can tell he's done something else, but we don't know what it is yet. And I think something that sets Stephen King apart as well, from a lot of writers, especially in the 21st century at least, a lot of his books should come with trigger warnings, because he's not afraid to really be a documentarian to some of the most awful things that human beings can do to each other. Like, this story doesn't have the radical elements of like vampires or pyrokinetic children. The horror is real life. The horror comes from the realisation that this is an everyday struggle. People are abused in the real world hundreds of thousands of times over, and that struggle could happen to anyone. And I think that's what makes reading this so uncomfortable, is knowing that we all have vulnerable moments. Someone out there could take advantage of you. And then how would you act in that moment? Would you do better than Dolores? Would you do worse? We don't know, because we're not there yet. I think determined to get the kids away from him, Dolores goes to the bank to withdraw all the kids' college savings. Her plan is like, we'll use that money to go to the mainland where we'll escape Joe. He won't be able to hurt any of us anymore. Imagine her surprise when she finds out that the thousands of dollars that she alone has been saving for the kids' college fund has been taken by Joe overnight. All of it. It's been put into his own personal account. She's furious, and rightly so, because he legally shouldn't have been able to access the kids' accounts without their paperwork, especially since he didn't save a cent of those savings himself. Dolores starts yelling at the bank teller because it's just such a gross injustice that clearly was motivated by misogyny.
It's because I'm a woman, ain't it? If it'd been the other way around, if I'd been the one passing off a fairy story how I'd lost a passbook and asked for a new one, if I'd been the one who started drawing out what took 11 years to put in, you would have called Joe.
The fact that a woman could never get away with what Joe as a man has done. They just let him withdraw this money that he had no right to on word of mouth alone. He had no evidence, none of the paperwork, but because he was a man and he was the father of the children, they just let him get away with it. At this point, her inside eye has only got more intense. Abusing her was one thing, you know, she could take it, but now Joe has been cruel enough to target their own children, and with a solar eclipse on the horizon, it's not looking good for Joe. I think just like that eclipse, Joe has single-handedly managed to sort of take all the light out of both Dolores and the lives of her children. He has to go. He simply has to go. She is cleaning in Vera's house. She doesn't know how she's going to do it. So she just breaks down in tears. And she confides in Vera herself about how helpless she feels after everything Joe has done. The way that he's abused Selena and taken all of their money so they can't even get away. This was one of my favourite exchanges in the story, the conversation between Vera and Dolores, because it's done really well in the film too.
Husbands die every day, Dolores. Why? One is probably dying right now while you're sitting here, weeping.
Vera, she says it so calmly, but with that sort of sinister glint in her eye. Like, you can tell she has had this predicament herself. She's like, sometimes men have accidents.
Sometimes they're driving home from their mistress's apartment, then their brakes suddenly fail. An accident, Dolores, can be an unhappy woman's best friend.
Sometimes your husband is on his way home from his mistress's apartment and the brakes in his car fail and he dies tragically. That's sad. That's a sad accident. And it's such a good scene, because up until this point, Vera and Dolores, they've been at each other's throats. But the moment Dolores needs advice, she gets support from a woman who's also been a victim of mistreatment at the hands of men. And I think it speaks to the emotional maturity of women versus men, the fact that they're so ready to support one another despite all of the animosity that's been between them both, you know. And not even necessarily the support between women, but the support between people who have gone through the same traumatic event. Like, she feels for her so intensely that she is saying these very legally suspicious things to her because she knows what it's like and she knows what she has to do. And so with the eclipse coming, she gives Dolores 2 of these special headsets to watch the eclipse with, the ones that stop you from going blind. And she says, you know, go home. Everyone on the island's going to be on my boat, you and your husband, you know, maybe you'll have an accident. The eclipse is probably the most iconic symbol of the story. I think especially because it was originally going to be called In the Path of the Eclipse. I think similar to Gerald's game as well, This type of eclipse is a once-in-a-century phenomenon, the kind that won't appear again for generations to come. And I think it's that reoccurring idea of a cyclical process that's passed down through many generations. Like, the next eclipse will be seen by their great-grandchildren. King might be implying that that's how many years it will take before this abuse is outpaced by the future, you know, the ripples of what Joe's done, because it really does disseminate through from person to person. Like, already the kids are reeling from what Joe's done. That will probably affect the grandkids. Maybe by the time there's great grandkids, when there's another eclipse, it will finally be over. So, Dolores goes home early from work on the day of the eclipse. Even though Vera's hosting a huge party, she's giving her this chance. She's like, you know, use this eclipse as an opportunity. Kill Joe. She never says it explicitly, though. That's the thing. But you can tell that's what's implied.
Sometimes, Dolores, sometimes you have to be a high-riding bitch to survive. Sometimes being a bitch is all a woman has to hang on to.
She finds an abandoned well in her garden. Her plan is to get Joe drunk enough that he'll fall 30 feet to his death down the well. It's the perfect accidental death by misadventure. Of course, it would be a bit boring if that all went to plan. Joe does get very drunk. She gives him some scotch that she bought him. But then a physical altercation results when she tells him that she knows about the money and she's taken it all back.
All that money given right back to me in cash. Ah, but the 500 you pissed away. So you can just go fuck yourself. That is, if you can get that limp old noodle of yours to stand up.
And that he's going to go to prison for fraud. He starts to chase her because she says that the money is down by the blackberry bushes. And she jumps the hole in the ground. Joe doesn't know it's there. He falls through it, but still is holding on to the edge. As it becomes clear to him that this was her setup all along. And he's screaming, he calls her horrible names, he begs her for help. He just wants somebody to come and rescue him. He's so, like, desperate.
Help, somebody! Oh, God, somebody help me, please! Help! You help! Help, somebody! Oh, God, damn it.
Nobody can hear you, Joe.
You bitch! Oh, you just better hope I don't get out of here.
I think this for me was the most horrifying part of the book, and I didn't expect to find it as scary as I did. Like, thank goodness I don't live near any wells. So he falls down the well right as the solar eclipse forms in the sky, but miraculously the fall doesn't kill him. We find out later that there's still some water at the bottom of the well that, like, cushioned his fall, and all of the alcohol as well in his system, like, it numbed the pain, so he didn't feel it as much. And he's so angry. He tries, but then this is what's unexpected. He's so injured, but he still has enough strength to climb out of the well. And in the darkness of the eclipse, she's looking down this 30-feet well, and she can see, like, his big pale face getting closer to the surface. It's getting larger as he's, like, climbing up and staring right at her with, like, pure hatred, and it's terrifying. Like, his hand wraps around her ankle and starts, like, pulling her down into the well with him, because I think at this point he's seen the writing on the wall. He knows, I'm probably going to die here, but his last dying wish is that she'll suffer with him, they'll die together. But she grabs, like, a big slab of rock from around the well and sort of brings it down on his head, which like smashes his dentures, knocks him right out. He falls back to the bottom of the well. She then goes back to the house. Understandably, she cannot sleep. I really don't blame her. Can still picture him at the bottom of that well, yelling for someone to help him. Like, she's not sure if it's a hallucination or if she can actually still hear him screaming. I mean, that's horrifying, isn't it? Like, that's just, ugh. Stephen King, what the hell? Like, visually, you don't expect him to be so resilient. I think Dolores even says herself that if he had lived the way he died, this would never have happened, because he was just so stubborn. Like, he wouldn't die. And it, really, really scary. The next morning, she checks the well, and yes, he is finally dead. I forgot to mention as well that during the eclipse, this is when she sees Jessie Burlingame, the main character from Gerald's Game. First, she sees her as a little girl being abused by her dad during the eclipse, and then she sees that Jessie's also in danger, likely from when her husband handcuffs her to the bed. But I think we'll talk about that more in my future Gerald's Game video. So, I love the way that these abuse victims, they almost seem to have like a psychic network that makes them aware of each other's plight. I think when you've gone through the same sort of experience like that, there is an automatic bond that King is sort of alluding to here that goes beyond everyday friendship. Which is why I really wanted Dolores to meet Jessie Burlingame, and I'm sad that that never happened. It takes a few days for the police to get involved and form a search party for Joe's body. Dolores is smart enough to sow the seeds of a distressed housewife whose husband never came home after the eclipse. When they do find his body at the bottom of the well, the way that Selena looks at her mother, even though Dolores has promised her, I had nothing to do with Joe's death, she knows. Again, it's that like woman's intuition. She's like looking at her mum in the eyes and she feels like she can never trust her again. And ironically, killing Joe seems to have solidified the rift between Dolores and her daughter. You know, she tried to protect her children, do right by them, but now they're constantly on edge around her, like everyone is. The coroner, as well, is very suspicious of Dolores.
Oh, hell, forget the missus. Anybody who's going to accuse me of killing my husband, go right ahead and call me Dolores.
He says that Joe died sooner because his ribs, they sort of perforated his lungs and he exhausted his leftover oxygen by screaming for hours. How did Dolores not hear the screaming when he was only like tens of feet away from where she was watching the eclipse? This argument is swept under the rug. Dolores genuinely, I feel, cries at the loss of Joe. Like, yes, she killed him, and yes, he did terrible things to her, but he was still her husband, and she did, like, have to listen to him screaming and in agony, and that really does start to haunt her in her dreams. Like, she has a guilty conscience about it. I think some of Joe's friends, as well as, like, teenagers around the island, they start to vandalise her house and hurl insults at her.
Know who you are? Just a little air and the rest of you! Come on down here! You got something to say to me?
Like, the locals know that she got away with murder and they're not happy about it. I think this public vitriol, it reaches like a fever pitch when we get to the death of Vera Donovan. I think I've already mentioned how in her twilight years she had like a sort of, it was almost like a mild delirium. She became more sickly. And with Dolores moving in to help her, their sort of relationship became more difficult.
I want my china pig. Get off your royal duck and go over there and get it. You both know you can do it. Do you good.
Need the exercise.
What I need is someone who'll do as they're told.
Don't go too far, Vera.
One day, while Dolores was hanging the sheets outside with 6 pins, mind you, not 4, 6, she hears Vera screaming for help. Dolores runs back to the house and she finds Vera terrified of the dust bunnies, which have now, Dolores can see it herself, they've taken the shape of Joe St. George. Vera jumps out of her wheelchair, which Dolores didn't even think was possible, inexplicably throws herself over the stair balcony and falls down several steps. By the time Dolores actually gets to her, it's very clear she's badly injured, she's about to die. Because she's very old, she's very frail, and very distressed. Vera begs Dolores to put her out of her misery. She's like, get something, blunt force to the head, end my suffering.
Will you help me, Dolores? Will you please help me die?
Which felt very reminiscent of The Woman in the Window, which is the last short story in Night Shift. Check out my Night Shift video for coverage on that. It's a great story. Dolores is panicking. She runs to the kitchen. She comes back with a marble rolling pin. She goes to lift it, to swing it down on her head for the killing blow. But 2 things happen.
If you really want to help me, please hurry. Oh, it's got some fun out of here.
Vera dies on her own. She doesn't need the final blow. And the postman, who has a key to the house, walks in on this whole scene. And of course, the postman sees the blood-covered pensioner passed out on the stairs and Dolores with a potential murder weapon rolling pin in her hand. He knows as good as anyone that she killed her husband and got away with it. Now everyone on the island thinks she killed Vera too. I think this is when we realise that the whole impetus for this police confessional was all about clearing her name of any allegation relating to the murder of Vera. Because she loved Vera. Like, they had their challenges and the other housemaids are aware of that. But it was a genuine accident. She would never have done that. I think what doesn't help is that after the funeral, after Vera has been taken care of, Dolores inherits everything. So her whole estate, worth around $30 million. Dolores isn't materialistic. She knows that this will be seen as a strong motive for her death. So Dolores donates all of the money to an orphanage, which is in all the newspapers, and seemingly is what repairs the relationship between Dolores and her daughter Selena. Like, this is also why we get the big reveal that Vera's children died shortly after her husband did, but she lied about them being alive to Dolores the whole time as a sort of coping mechanism. The idea that in her grief, she thought if she could convince just one person, then at least they still lived on in someone's mind, which is so upsetting and does give Dolores some perspective on how she needs to appreciate her children now that their father is gone. And it really does nicely wrap up this whole theme of suffering and the trials of womanhood. So that's the book. Life moves on for Dolores. She's a fighter, a survivor. She overcomes the odds of her humble beginnings and lives as an independent woman. She's outgrown Joe's controlling abuse. She never needed Vera's millions in inheritance, and she also doesn't need the validation or the favour of the locals and the neighbours who still think she's a cold-blooded killer. Sure, she killed Joe, but she did it to protect her children, who are now thriving despite the echoes of what their father did still in their lives. I think it's a beautiful tale about how life is full of hardship. There's trials, there's tribulations, but that's never an excuse to not stay true to yourself and your own integrity.
I'm very sorry, but...
You say you're sorry one more time and I'll kick your butt up so high you'll look like a hunchback.
And I think this might be King's most underrated book for that reason. Because it's very much an anthem for not getting swept up in the horrors of life, you know, in the same way that King sort of powered through his battles with addiction. Dolores is that same figure sort of powering through her story of abuse. On the topic of underrated, this book also has a movie adaptation that is perfection. In some ways, I think it even improves on the book. I think one of the reasons it's so underrated is because Dolores Claiborne is played by Kathy Bates, and you're always going to associate her with Misery before you even realise that she did this King adaptation as well. I won't deny that Misery is probably a better book and a better film, but Kathy Bates, when you compare these two performances, she shows an unbelievable amount of versatility. Like, you can see why she's an Oscar winner. Like, when you compare the crazed villainy of Annie Wilkes to this, like, sympathetic heroine of Dolores Claiborne, it's inspired, like, how well she plays it. I think they realised, too, that the film would be boring if it was exactly like the book, i.e. she was telling the whole story through a police confessional, because that would rely too much on narration, which never should be in a film for too much. So instead, it's all about Dolores retelling the story of Joe's murder and Vera's death to Selena. Like, Selena's come back to the island in an attempt to fix their mother-daughter relationship. And I think that's much more visceral than telling the police. The movie also, and I was very impressed by this, the movie doesn't shy away at all from portraying the horrors of Joe physically abusing Dolores and also sexually abusing Selena. Like, there are scenes where both of those are shown and it's so uncomfortable. Like, it's horrible to watch, but that's exactly how it should be. It should make you feel uneasy.
How do you?
Yes!
They also make a deliberate effort to remove any of the supernatural elements from the story. Like, of course, we still get the solar eclipse, but there's no dust bunnies forming into dead husbands. And when Joe falls down the well, he never tries to climb out. We never, like, hear his screaming, like, haunting her. He dies the moment he hits the bottom of the well. It's much more of a gritty reality piece. And I appreciated that shift because I think comparing it to the movie version of Gerald's Game, I think that goes in the opposite direction. And I think it cheapens the message slightly that the domestic abuse wasn't strong enough on its own, that they have to bring in the Moonlight Man to be creepy. So I think I enjoy this film more than that one. But then I haven't read Gerald's Game, so maybe I'll feel differently once I've read that book. I also love the actress who played Vera Donovan. Like, she made the role more fabulous than it had any right to be. And when either when she's, like, about to die and is very senile, she was so dramatic. Like, I loved it, and I loved her. Her advice to Dolores as well about men having accidents, that whole scene is a standout. Like, that scene is so good. I think it was a nice touch too how the actor who plays the bank teller in this film is the same actor who plays the warden in the Shawshank Redemption. I bring that up because when Joe is chasing Dolores in the garden to the well just before he dies, she tells him that he'll be put in Shawshank prison for a long time for bank fraud.
Get my bill!
The only thing you're gonna get is a long stretch in Shawshank prison for child molesting.
Goddamn bitch!
So that common actor between the two movies really ties that together and points out how cool that connection is. I think people always get very excited with the ways that King has a multiverse, and I do wish there were more crossovers, because I, for one, do really appreciate them. Like, I haven't watched Storm of the Century yet, but I'm pretty sure that takes place on the island of Little Tor, which is the same island that Dolores Claiborne takes place on. But yeah, I can't sing the praises of this film enough. Like, the cast is great, the directing is great, the acting, next level. Like, Kathy Bates. What more do you need to know? Kathy Bates. I think that wraps the video up nicely. Did you enjoy Dolores Claiborne as much as I did? Probably not, because I loved it. Remember to like, comment, subscribe, all that fun stuff. Hopefully I'll be back with another Stephen King video soon. And as always, toodaloo.